So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today at the British Museum. And I'd also like to give a warm welcome to the thousands of people watching worldwide on the camera here via Periscope. Make sure to tweet any questions you have to #AfricanRockArt for Professor Pearce. So this is our third and final of this year's African Rock Art Lecture Series. My name is Elizabeth Galvin. I'm the curator of the African Rock Art Image Project here at the British Museum. We're very lucky that this project and this lecture series is sponsored by the Arcadia Fund, who have dedicate the fund towards preserving endangered heritage and knowledge. So we're very lucky here also to have Professor Pearce. He is the Associate Professor of Archaeology and the Director of the Rock Art Research Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. As the Director of RARI, the Rock Art Research Institute, he works in close relation to the South African Rock Art Digital Archive, SARADA, the biggest collection of rock art images in Africa, also based at Wits University. He has run a multi-institutional research project on the later Stone Age rock art and related archaeology in South Africa's Eastern Cape Province, and he currently also directs an international project developing techniques to date rock art and rock paintings. His main research interests are cognitive archaeology and late Stone Age rock art and burial practices. He has written countless articles and books, including 2 publications co-authored with David Lewis Williams. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor David Pearce.
Thank you, and good afternoon. As we just heard, this is the third lecture in a series on rock art in Africa. Why, though, should we be interested in rock art? There's certainly much of it is very, very beautiful, as I hope you'll see some of the photos as we go along. People like to collect things. The sites they've visited, the sites they've discovered, the photos they've taken, maybe enjoys just the walking to find the places. Lots of reasons to be interested in rock art, lots of reasons to enjoy it.
Please, can the sound system be turned up?
Right, maybe I should do that.
No.
Right. Okay. Right. Whilst those are all perfectly good reasons to be interested in rock art, it goes. There's more to it than that. Rock art has the potential to provide insights into some of the most interesting and difficult to access aspects of the lives of past peoples, their ritual, religion, and the workings of their cosmology. And that's what I hope in some small way to show you today is some part of that. I'm going to break from tradition here and not show you a Google map to orient you, but instead Emmanuel Bowen's more spectacular map of Africa from the 1740s. And of course there's rock art throughout most of Africa. It really very diverse all over the place. But today I'm going to focus right down at the bottom of Africa, down here, entirely within South Africa, and more specifically down within the Drakensberg Range, which runs along here. The mountains are a little bit nearer the coast than Bowen marks them there. And in fact, more or less where these two lines here intersect, about 30 degrees east of the meridian of London and just less than 30 degrees south of the equator. We have a variety of different types of rock art, different traditions of rock art in South Africa. Some of these are very local, only occurring in quite small areas, whereas some of them are much more widespread. We have things like this, for instance, usually attributed to herders who arrived in the area a bit less than 2,000 years ago. Very geometric, lots of squares, circles, divided circles, rayed circles, these long rows of finger dots, and so on. We also have things that look a bit like that. These white finger-painted, almost entirely white, finger-painted things, human figures, a variety of animals, related mostly to farming communities, these northern Sotho up in the northern parts of the country. But what I'm going to speak about today is the hunter-gatherer art. Quite a different sort of thing, occurring across all of southern Africa, south of the Zambezi. But I say I'm going to focus on the art in the Drakensberg. This is a little piece of the mountain. Here we see it in winter, unfortunately. It's much greener in the summer. And we have, the way it works, we've got these low mountains down below, the higher mountains in the background. It's all sandstone with the higher mountains capped with basalt. Now on these lower mountains you'll see the rock exposed along the tops of these ridges. That's what John Dunn, who first described the rock, just called the cave sandstone. It's a very good name. It's now called Clarence Formation, but it does erode into a whole load of shelters all along these ridges. And it's in these shelters that we find the paintings. Just going to show you a few pictures now of the sort of thing we've got. And obviously there's huge variety in this art. There's some small sites and big sites, sites with a few paintings, sites with a lot of paintings, and so on. But it's not unusual, though, to see wonderful large panels like this. This is about 6 meters long, several hundred figures in there. And you'll see there are lots and lots of things next to each other, on top of each other, all over the place, in fact. Lots of human figures in there. You can see up there, lots of eland, these large antelope across everything. I said, things on top of each other. Around about here, there are about 5 layers of paint stacked up on top of each other. So really dense, lots and lots of things in there. Numerically in the art, the things we find most are the human figures, and they're really very, very diverse. Humans are painted in all manner of different ways, different sizes, different colors, different amounts of detail. And just to show you a few examples. There are 4 figures here. The bodies are done in white, and most of that white is faded off, so a little bit difficult to see. And these are not very big, smallish things. You can see the legs on this figure here, the torso with the whites disappearing, an arm out the back holding a bow, an arrow held with the bow. And look at this extraordinary head with all that incredible detail on it. Those lines and dots, incredible detail. Another figure here, one sitting here and another sitting there. Really tiny detail. Much of the detail we get in this art is really millimeter-sized detail. Very, very detailed things, lots of variety. Here's some more human figures. Different again, you can see in the way they're painted, the way they look. Got this bow player sitting here. You can see the resonator down here, the bow up over his shoulder, and a stick that he's using to tap the bowstring, making the music. Again, incredible detail in the painting. These dots on his head, these things hanging down, and so on. Another figure squatting here and clapping. Again, these really tiny little details of the fingers and the toes and all sorts of things. Look at that one, for example. Again, it's not a very big painting. These are little things with this incredible detail. Again, very different from the ones we've been looking at a moment ago. The detail on the hair, the details of the face, the red lines coming back from the nose here. These things hanging down the back, a fly whisk, a stick, this red line with white dots wound around the body. But as we move down this figure, though, we see that this one's not entirely a human figure. These legs are not human legs. And as we get down to the bottom here, we see, in fact, has hooves, and indeed the fetlocks of an antelope. So this one is a partly human, partly antelope figure, something that we do see fairly often in the paintings, these part human, part animal figures, mostly part antelope. Many of them, in fact, have antelope heads as well as the legs. We get things like that. I'm sure you can see what that is. We've got piece of rock up here, and then figure outlined in red coming down. There's a leg over here and gets a bit fuzzy towards the back, filled in with white, and then these red finger dots all over it. Bizarre things like this we find in the art, as well as these very realistic, real-looking things. Then, of course, they're the eland. I mentioned them. Whilst the human figures may numerically dominate the art, the eland certainly visually dominated. And you go into these sites and these big panels, it's really eland that you see everywhere. And huge attention is lavished on painting these eland. They're one of the few types of paintings we see that are shaded. Shading is very, very unusual in rock art. pretty much anywhere. But eland, particularly in the Drakensberg, are shaded. You have the colours shaded from the dark on the back down to the white belly. You can see the shoulder here and various details sort of modelled with the colour. Very, very unusual around the world in rock art, but this is what we see in the eland. And also incredible detail in the painting itself, what gets painted. So if you look here, we've got the chin painted, little line of the mouth, the nose, the eye, the red hair on the forehead, the red hair inside the ear, the longer hair up on the back. Here the tail swept back across the body. And again, these the details of the hooves, the hair on the dewlap, little Adam's apple. Really incredible detail goes into painting these eland. So I think perhaps we can agree on the first part. These paintings, many of them are really very beautiful. And again, these are not big. This figure's that size. How, though, do we know more about them? How do we go beyond just looking at them and even looking closely at them, looking at these tiny details, to say something more about them? And we're very fortunate in Southern Africa to have very detailed ethnographies from a number of Bushman groups which help us to understand these paintings. We've got ethnographies from a variety of Kalahari groups, Kalahari up here, the Kanzi, the Naro, Gwi, Kho, and these are relatively recent ethnographies from the 1950s onwards. We've got excellent material from the 1870s, from Kham Bushmen, from the Karoo area. And we have a remarkable account from a man by the name of King in the Luti-Drakensberg Mountains. King assisted a man called Joseph Orpen leading a military operation. He was guiding him in the mountains. But on the way, he told him many stories and remarkably explained some rock paintings to him. These are the only accounts we've got from a bushman living at that time explaining rock paintings. Orpen wrote these up. He published it in an article in 1874 in the Cape Monthly magazine. And he also published his copies of some of these paintings along with it. And some people may recognize the very famous Hong Hong paintings there and the Medicani ones there. And there are comments on these paintings that Orpen recorded. The Kham material that I mentioned from a little further west of here, in the Northern Cape, was collected the project was started by a man by the name of Wilhelm Blake, a linguist working in Cape Town. And he got a number of, there he is in fact. In fact, you may notice he's got a copy of some rock art on the table behind him. He got a number of Bushmen, people who, from further north, who'd somehow either offended the colonial authorities or in prison in Cape Town. He got these people to come and live with him for various periods of time and took down what they had to say. He was obviously interested in the language, but he recorded a great deal of material, myths, stories, histories, all manner of things, working with his sister-in-law, Lucy Lloyd. There's one of the people he worked with, Abu, one of the older men who really recounted all manner of remarkable things. And they took, this is in the 1870s, no tape recorders, so they wrote it all down. In fact, they recorded 12,000 pages of these verbatim testimonies from a variety of people. As you'll see here, it's only the right-hand pages are numbered. This is page 8033, so we've got 12,000 right-hand pages. The way these work is that the page is divided into two, and on this side you've got whatever it is people were saying written down in the Kham language in a phonetic script, and then that transliterated into English on the other side, with then various notes on the left-hand pages. And here, in fact, we have some brief details on Abu from his son-in-law. He says, my father-in-law has mantises. He was a mantises man. And then it goes on to talk more about mantises and so on. So this really is an amazing resource, huge resource in the original Kham language with the words, everything there for us to use. That article I mentioned by Orpen in the Cape Monthly magazine, Before it was published, the editor sent the draft article to Blake. He was the Bushman expert in Cape Town, along with the copies, which he showed to his informants. And all sorts of interesting things came out of that. And he wrote a comment to go along with the Orpin's article when it was published, talking about the paintings, the comments, comparing what Orpin's informants had said with what his had, and so on. But towards the end of that comment, along with this article, he said, and now talking about the paintings specifically, he described them as an attempt, however imperfect, at a truly artistic conception of the ideas which most deeply moved the Bushman mind and filled it with religious feeling. Now consider this is in the 1870s. People were shooting Bushmen. This is really quite startling at that time. And Blake certainly was a man ahead of his time in what he was doing and the way he was thinking about these things. His prescient words, however, were ignored largely for the better part of the next century. It was only really in the 1960s and late 1960s, 1970s, that people really started going back to these ethnographies and looking at them in detail, looking at what they really said, and bringing that together with the paintings. And it was particularly the work of David Lewis Williams where this really came together. Despite his own misgivings, initial misgivings, as well as that of many other people, he found, and others have done this as well, that there are remarkable similarities between the accounts of these various groups. From further north, those groups I showed you up in the Kalahari, Kham, and what King had to say for that matter. Remarkable similarities, but not completely. The similarities there are also quite substantial differences between many of them. But the similarities all focus particularly on the areas of religion and ritual. Incredible similarities in those areas between all of those groups. So it was with that and using these ethnographies, the older material from Blake and King's account, and at that time fairly new material coming out of the Kalahari, that things really started to come together. And what Lewis Williams did, he was concerned particularly with ritual and how ritual may work with all of this. So he looked at all the major rituals in Bushman society across these groups. Boys' first kill rituals, girls' puberty rites, marriage, and most importantly, the trance or medicine dance. That is the central religious rite of all these Bushman groups. And it's that really articulates with the paintings. The other rituals we don't see anything in the paintings that really link up with them particularly well. But the trance dance, on the other hand, we do. So what is this trance dance? This is one of the Marshall family's photos of one of these dances. They usually happen at night. They usually go on all night. They usually have a circular form. The way it tends to work is you've got a group of mostly men, sometimes some women as well, dancing around in a circle, mostly women, some men though as well, sitting in the middle of that circle, singing and clapping the rhythms of the medicine songs, fire burning, going round and round and round all night. As people do this, they carry various particular pieces of equipment with them. They carry dancing sticks to support their weight, carry fly whisks. Often they have rattles wound around their legs, stamping along, music clapping, these rattles going in a circle. They also, as they go along, adopt a variety of postures, quite distinct postures. People say they have a conception of a supernatural energy that is used for all sorts of things. They say this burns and boils in their bellies, and it's very painful. So people bend forward to relieve that pain, often supporting their weight with these dancing sticks. People also put their arms out backwards, asking God to put potency into their spine. People talk about their noses bleeding, and so on. So there are a whole load of very distinct things that are used in these dances, and that people do in these dances. The whole idea of the thing is really to dance yourself into a trance state. and what people believe to be the spirit world. And there you can do a variety of things. Healing is a very important one of those. Everybody at a dance would typically get healed, and this is both of physical ills as well as social ills. And it's done in a whole variety of different ways, laying on of hands, using those fly whisks to sort of wipe over people, what's been referred to as snoring, sort of snorting sickness out of people with your nose. Healing's a very important thing. Controlling the weather. The rain is thought of as an animal that you can, in the spirit world, capture if you're sufficiently good at it, sufficiently strong enough. Take it to somewhere where you need it to rain, and you can then kill that animal. And its blood, if it's a female rain, its milk would then come down as precipitation. You can see where the game is. Maybe you can control it a little bit. You can move about in the world and go to other places, see what people are doing in other places. You could perhaps even go up to God's house in the sky. And in the spirit world, people see all sorts of things, spirits of the dead, various creatures that live there. And they themselves may transform. As people go into the spirit world, they may start becoming an animal of some sort. So that's more or less what these dances are about, and they're performed frequently. And although they're very important, they're not necessarily very formal. So children will be involved, people start and stop, and so on. And that really is the key to the art and the easiest way into it, because we do in fact find some paintings of these dances. There are not a great many that look like this. We've got a circular dance like that, but there are a few. More often we tend to find the dancers strung out in a line like you see in this drawing. And here you can see all of those postures I mentioned, the figures, I think all of them bending forward, many of them with their arms back, many of them bleeding from the nose, some with those dancing sticks, some with fly whisks. These very distinctive postures and items of equipment that people carry in these dances. More commonly still, though, is simply to find individual figures like this scattered about in a panel of paintings, apparently just there on their own. But again, in these very distinct postures, this one bending forward with the dancing sticks and the blood coming from the nose. But we see all these various postures and so on in these figures scattered about in otherwise apparently ordinary panels. The art, though, is not just illustrations of the rituals people perform. It goes a lot further than that and really is central to people's religion. And we find in the paintings a great many other things besides just these dances. We see many of the things that people say they see or they do in the spirit world. We go back to that figure, for example. This is one of these transforming or transformed figures that we hear about with the antelope legs, the hooves. I say that these are fairly common, many of them with antelope heads. A rain animal coming out of this corner of the rock. There's a whole dance thing going on over here, coming out with this dance. So a great deal of this art does relate to the trance dance, the performance of the dance, bits and pieces, ideas coming out of it, and the things people see in the spirit world, the things people say they do in the spirit world. And some of the paintings like these are really quite clear about this. They really fit together very, very nicely with what people say. And it's quite easy to do this because these are obviously not real things. We don't really find things like this wandering around in the Drakensberg. But what about the things that really do exist that we see in the paintings? What about things like the eland, for example? We do find them wandering around in the mountains, these very large, very elegant antelope. What about them in the paintings? They're clearly real things. I'm going to take you to a site I'm currently working on, just to have a look at some eland. Back in the mountains, there's some of this time, you can see it's a bit more green, and the site's just down here in this valley, just below where we're standing here. And they are eland. there's a few other things off to the side here, but this panel really is just filled with eland. A few human figures in it, but really it's lots and lots of eland. They're very beautiful eland, they're very realistic eland. Lots of them standing around doing elandy things. So what about that? But even with this sort of thing, if we look closely, we find far more interesting things. I hope you'll recognize this one up here. We had a look at it a bit earlier, that one. Possibly the most realistic painting of an eland we've ever seen. But if we look carefully, even this is not entirely real. If you look very, very carefully, you'll see that here there's another piece of leg sticking out. It's in white along here, yeah, a bit bigger. Another piece of leg painted out there. There's not a superpositioning. There's not another painting under here where it's just a bit sticking out. This eland's just got an extra leg sort of painted sticking out from behind his other one. And in fact, a lot of the paintings in this panel have extra body parts. We look at this group, for example. I don't know how clearly you can see it here, but this one up here has in fact got 2 pairs of horns, 4 horns in total, and 4 ears. Again, not a superpositioning. These are all painted in there. And this eland, 4 legs. Again, not a superpositioning. Not even the way legs are normally painted. 4 legs just painted in there at the front. And there are a number of other examples in this panel. One's got 2 tails and so on. Not quite real after all. These ones are also quite nice because you'll see this one over here. His legs are painted right down to this angle in the rock. This piece of rock here juts out from the flat face. And its hind legs are painted right down into that crack. Make it look like it's walking out from that crack. That's also something not entirely unusual. We find this sort of thing in quite a number of sites, paintings done to interact with features of the rock, cracks like the steps, various features. Paintings walking out of them, or maybe walking into them. And in fact, there are some more like this in this shelter, not quite as clear as this one, but paintings looking into the rock and so on. We think that this thing with the rock relates to people's conceptions of their cosmos. I mentioned that we're talking about the dance, that you go to the spirit world. The spirit world's thought to exist all around us, but to be up in the sky and to be down underground. And we think that underground continues up through the mountains behind the rock, and that in fact these rock faces are membranes between the human world and the spirit world, and that these paintings related to the spirit world in various ways are not just interacting with the rock, but are essentially penetrating that membrane, these spirit world things in this very important place, moving between these two worlds. And we find things like this in the paintings in a number of places, as I said. So even in a panel like this with a whole load of simple, realistic eland, there's a great deal more to the art than may at first appear. And we need to look very, very carefully at these paintings to start finding these clues. I'm going to now take you to another site I'm working on, a few kilometers from that last one. We're back in winter now, brown and dead again. We're down in this valley this time, a very little narrow valley, not a particularly exciting looking valley. And in this site, it's about 20 meters long, and there are paintings scattered through most of the length of the shelter, a few all the way along. But the majority of them are centered or concentrated more or less in the center about here, on either side of a bulge of rock up there. That's where most of those paintings are centered. And have a look at them. On the left-hand side of that bulge, we've got all this going on. It's very, very dense in here, quite difficult to pick some of it apart, but lots and lots of interesting things. There's a whole lot of eland almost entirely stacked up on top of each other here, very difficult to pull apart. Big human figure bending forward here, another big figure there, some more human figures, some little ones holding out something to the eland's face there. Down under this ledge, you can't see it very well, it's the rock sloping upwards into the ceiling. A whole lot of hartebeest also stacked up on top of each other. Little black human figures here. Really lots and lots of interesting things in this panel. As we move just around that bulge of rock, we've got that. And again, there's all sorts of fascinating things in here. This eland up at the top, a rather strangely painted head, parts of these big human figures here, another really interesting hartebeest over there, all sorts of bits and pieces. But what really strikes you about, or certainly strikes me about this panel, is that a great deal of it's not there anymore. It's fallen off. We're not entirely sure why this is flaking as it is, but it's doing it very, very rapidly. This photo was taken in 2011. It's worse than that now. If we just compare that, that's what it looked like in 1967. So this really was an astonishing, astonishing panel. And I say, unfortunately, very rapidly deteriorating. Now, I'm not going to talk about the paintings in the site too much, the detail of those paintings, and fascinating as they are. I'm going to concentrate on those flakes that have fallen off. We've been collecting them over a number of years now. We're somewhere a bit short of 300 flakes now from that panel. There's not much to do with them. They don't really fit together very well. We can't really fit them back onto the wall very well. But what we have done, we started looking at the paint on those panels, the paint itself. And it's not that no work on this sort of thing has been done before. There has been bits and pieces in South Africa on work on the paint. But we've started doing some new work on it, based on these flakes. And it's turned out to be fairly interesting. The colour range is a bit limited. We had light red and darker red on the flakes, and indeed they're made by using two different recipes, hematite coming from different places, mixed in different ways, and so on, which is really quite interesting, getting into these sorts of details. But what really astonished us was that the black paint is carbon-based. Now, that may not sound all that astonishing, but received wisdom for many, many years now in Southern African rock art work is that the black paints are made out of manganese minerals. Carbon is much more interesting for us because it opens the possibility of being able to radiocarbon date these things. And we've subsequently done that. I've been doing all this work characterizing these paints and radiocarbon work, working with the Delphine Bonneau in Montreal and a number of people at the University of Oxford here. And mostly through Delphine's very hard work in the laboratory, we've managed to find ways of cleaning up this paint. Obviously, rocks faces are very active, very messy surfaces. So cleaning all that mess out to get just the carbon out of that paint and being able to radiocarbon date them. We did this first, as I said, on some of these flakes. These three, in fact. As I said, they're not terribly exciting when you look at the flakes now, but being able to date them really was a very exciting thing for us. And the dates turn out quite nicely. They're all around about 2,000 years ago. We've subsequently extended this work to look at dating in situ paintings still up on the wall. And we've managed to do that as well. We've been working mostly in this area of the southern Drakensberg, as well as areas in Lesotho and in Botswana. And we now have dates from all three areas. But the most we have is from this site, this site I've been showing you. So we've now got these three dates on the flakes, I told you, 2,000-ish years. These three black human figures up there, just under that ledge. Got dates on two of those. This one's one of the hoofs, one of those black hoofs I showed you, from a big eland painted in the middle. And then on this side, we've got part of that large red and black figure, that black figure. And this is a leg of another one of those big walking human figures. So we've got 6 dates on the wall, 3 on the flakes, 9 dates all in all. It makes this, I think, these are all direct dates on that paint. best dated site in Africa now, which is really, really very exciting. And of course, we're putting these direct radiocarbon dates into that sequence of paintings, linking up with the relative chronologies to build up a quite good chronology of the paintings in the site. And obviously, from a technical point of view, this is all terribly exciting for us because we couldn't do it and now we can, and it opens up all sorts of new possibilities. But I think what's especially exciting with this site is the range of those dates. I told you already the flakes are about 2,000 years. A couple of the paintings on this side are a bit younger than that, 1,600, 700 sort of years ago, and the ones on this side are a bit short of 3,000 years ago. That really is quite a range of dates for those paintings, bit over 1,000 years, which is really quite a long time. We've had people revisiting this shelter for more than 1,000 years. People revisiting this shelter, performing some kind of ritual acts there for more than 1,000 years. Adding paintings, clearly not very many over that period of time, but adding paintings over that period to those already there for a very, very long time. Interacting with and using the site, I say, for more than 1,000 years. And that, I think, really is a most extraordinary thing. The importance of a place like this, it's a narrow little valley high in the mountains, where people continue to come for, I say, that really long period of time, continuing to perform their ritual, their religion, and do interact with their spirit world in this place. I hope with this that I've been able to give you at least a little insight into something of what we know about the rock art in South Africa, this hunter-gatherer art, that it's, whilst maybe very beautiful, very exciting to find, also when we start looking at the details, start linking those details with the ethnographies we have, an incredibly important resource, an incredibly important way of learning about the lives and beliefs of people in the past. Thank you.
And we have some microphones here, if there's any questions. Yes. Jorge?
Why is it that in Europe we can often date rock art back perhaps 15,000 years ago, and you're only talking here about perhaps 3,000 years?
I think that's possibly largely to do with preservation. Much of the art in Europe is in deep underground limestone caves, which are really very well protected. Most of what I've been showing you is in fairly open rock shelters on quite soft sandstones. So I suspect most of this just doesn't last that long. The painter tradition in Southern Africa is rather long. The earliest dates we do have are not direct dates on paintings themselves, but from some little slabs of painted stone that were buried in the deposit in a rock shelter in Namibia, a site called Apollo 11. They date back to somewhere between 25,500 and 27,000 years ago. And as I mentioned, dating is not easy, and we don't have a great many dates. But we do have a number of dates in between that early date and the more recent ones. So we certainly, people are making art in Southern Africa for a very long time, and very likely making it continuously. So this is not just an old tradition, it's a continuous tradition as well.
And we have a question from online, and that is, do Southern Africans still paint and practice this rock art?
No. We think, I mentioned it's a long and continuous tradition. We've got pretty good evidence that people were painting just south of where I've been showing you these sites from until somewhere in the 1920s, but it's not something that's continuing now, no.
I thought I saw in the Cape Town Museum a reference to records of paint dating back to about 60,000 BC, collected in shells and that sort of thing. Is that complete nonsense?
No, that's not nonsense at all. When I said 27,000 years is the oldest paintings we have, they're the oldest paintings. There are various older things going back much, much earlier that may or may not be art, depending on how you think of it. We've got some little blocks of ochre from the site on the southwestern coast called Blombos, which have got there are a couple of them there with these cross-hatched designs on the stone, which date to about 77,000 years ago. And there are a number of other pieces of engraved ochre like that from surrounding sites. They're engravings on ostrich eggshell, going back to about 100,000 years. I think what you're referring to is that same Blombos site. A few years ago, they found the earliest, I think, evidence of paint. They're these big seashells that have the dried remains of liquid paint in it. And it's not just pigment, it was paint. It's ground ochre along with some fats and other things. And in fact, it's an amazing excavation. They found drops of that paint in the fine sediment around it. So, and that is about 100,000 years old. What people were doing with that paint, we don't know, but certainly people were making paint that long ago.
I understood you to say that the rock was believed to be some kind of symbolic membrane was between the spirit and the experienced world. Was that because the people didn't travel very far, or is that a much more sort of sophisticated idea in sort of symbolic form?
I think more of a symbolic idea that of where the spirit world is in relation to the human world, and there are particular places where you can penetrate these worlds. So rivers, waterholes, that sort of thing are places where you can move between the worlds and where you can go there and things can come out. So they're important places, but also slightly dangerous places. And we think that rock shelters work in very much the same way. They're sort of holes beginning to push into that underground world, and then the rock wall being that membrane between the two worlds.
Thank you. Would you say a bit more about the non-figurative art, the symbols, and particularly the follow-on from Louis Williams's work, perhaps, and what's the current thinking?
The sort of things I showed you right at the beginning. Yeah. They were made by completely different people, or as far as we understand at least. They're thought to have been related to herding peoples who moved down some way or other into South Africa, maybe a bit less than 2,000 years ago. They seem to largely follow major river courses and that sort of thing, which is where these people are supposed to have moved along. They're found in shelters in slightly different places. We get some of them engraved as well as painted. But at this stage, we don't really know much about them, why people were making them, what they meant, why they were using them. No one's yet done that work.
Thank you, General. Was there somebody who painted, I mean, in the hierarchy, were there painters or everybody could just paint?
We don't really know exactly who it was who did the paintings. We have no ethnographies relate to this at all. We suspect it wasn't just anybody who could paint, but we may have been wrong. Certainly the things that get painted are largely things related to the spirit world and are revelations from that world, things people would have seen and experienced there. So we're not absolutely sure, though, whether it's those ritual specialists who went to that other world who then painted what they saw, or whether they came back and told someone else and they did the painting, or whether it's some kind of muddle of different ways of doing it. Whether you had to have been there to have made the painting, or whether it could be done independently of that experience. So we don't know exactly who did it, but no.
And we have another question online. This question is from Japan. It says, is there a connection between the hybrid of the man animals and the way that they're represented in other places in Africa, such as in Egyptian hybrid animal statues?
I think there's certainly no direct connection. All over the world, people have part human, part animal things, creatures in their worlds. I don't think there's certainly any direct connection, though, between the Southern African art and what we find in Egypt.
Somebody earlier on mentioned about caves. I don't know much about South African geology. Are there many cave systems available where early peoples could have gone in and painted? Or is it perhaps not available?
We do have cave systems. We don't have huge numbers of them, but in the right geology, we certainly get limestone caves very similar to those in France where you find the paintings. But we don't find any paintings in those caves. The nearest I've seen paintings are on the walls just outside some cave mouths, but we've never found paintings inside caves. In the Kango cave system, for example, which is sort of the middle south kind of area, but inland, there's a little bit of archaeological remains going a very short way into the caves, but after that there's nothing at all. So certainly no paintings in the caves.
Thank you. You mentioned that this particular artwork is deteriorating over time and quite significantly. Is that the same in other rock paintings in South Africa? And is there anything that can be done that's acceptable to try and preserve what there is?
The answer is it's very, very variable. We've got a lot of sites, different places, different situations, and the state of their preservation is very, very variable. This site is really extreme. We don't often see sites falling to pieces like this. There are other sites where things are flaking off. Occasionally we have bigger pieces fall off, that kind of thing. Overall, a lot of the paintings are really quite stable. The way they're affixed to the rock is quite good. It's good paint, and then what's going on with the minerals in the rock is they're pretty much cemented in there with layers of calcium oxalate. So a lot of the paint's quite stable on the rock. The big problems we have are outside things that affect the sites. Animals do quite a lot of damage in some cases, and of course humans are one of the really big problems. Graffiti, vandalism of all sorts, making fires in sites. That really is the big problem, and it's really a problem of managing sites, and you can go there. But an awful lot of them are in private properties all over the place. It's a difficult problem.
Got a final question from online, which says, who took part in these rituals? Was it restricted to certain persons, or was it a whole group ritual?
Everybody. These are very important rituals, these trance dances and what went on with them, but they weren't exclusive. It wasn't only some people who could do them. Everybody had to be there, and it wasn't really good form not to be there. So there are usually only one or two, few really good dancers who could dance themselves into that trance state, who could go to the spirit world, but everybody participated. To one or other extent. Many people would dance, other people would sit and sing and clap, the children would be involved, so everybody was there, and it was very important that everyone was there.
Okay, let's do one last question.
Can you tell us something about the rock engravings, the ones that one sees in Tweefontein in Namibia? Are these fairly widespread, or is that the only site?
No, the engravings are quite widespread. I didn't mention it today, but we've got both painted and engraved art in South Africa, in Southern Africa. The fairly simplistic separation is we tend to find the paintings in places where we have rock shelters, which tends to be more around the edge of the place. the middle tends to be fairly flat, and that's where we tend to find the rock engravings. We typically see those in these very flat landscapes. We get these little low hills and boulder scatters on those hills, and we find things carved into those rocks. There are a lot of similarities. There are obviously a lot of differences. The whole geography of the thing is quite different. We've got often individual figures on individual rocks scattered about, but there are a lot of engraved sites as well.
Well, thank you very much. We're so pleased to have you here. And if you're still interested in African rock art, I encourage you to visit britishmuseum.org/African rock art to learn more about the project. And if you're interested, to watch a replay of this and the other lectures we've had this year. So thank you very much. That was fascinating.
Pleasure.